Welcome to the Real Estate Espresso Podcast, your morning shot of what's new in the world of real estate investing. I'm your host, Victor Menashe. On today's show, we're looking at some of the currents that are underneath the surface, which to me are pretty concerning. We have a history as a society of taking quantum steps to relinquish our individual rights in response to a crisis, or in some cases, just for convenience. In the wake of September 11, 2001, many people in the West allowed governments to collect so much more information about each and every one of us in the name of safety. Well, Winston Churchill said, never let a good crisis go to waste. Today, payments are increasingly electronic, which means your banker knows when you bought pizza from Dominos at 2 in the morning. So far, the government doesn't know that you ordered pizza at 2 in the morning, but if they did, what value judgment would be applied to that transaction? Would it potentially impact your credit score? Right now, the relationship between you and a private bank is limited. Yes, transactions above $600 are now required to be reported to the IRS. Cash transactions above €1,000 are illegal in France. In Italy, the limit was €2,000 and it was scheduled to drop to €1,000 at the start of January. They've just recently raised that limit to €5,000. There's a lot of legislation to eliminate gray market economy and ensure maximum compliance with tax collection. But today we've got a bigger problem. Banks are failing. In the old days, when banks ran into liquidity issues, they would sometimes look to the Federal Reserve's discount window. More often than not, they would look to one another to fund short-term needs. Well, the Dodd-Frank Act of 2010 included several measures aimed at reducing counterparty risk. In truth, unless you hold a physical asset in your possession, it's virtually impossible to eliminate counterparty risk altogether. The way the government's been reducing counterparty risk is by making sure that it's the Federal Reserve that's the other counterparty. The assumption is that the Fed is as good as gold when it comes to being a counterparty. After all, they have the power of the purse. So if the Fed is backstopping the bank, they have her back. What's a well-known fact that the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation is grossly underfunded. They've got $122 billion on their balance sheet to cover about $7 trillion in FDIC-insured deposits and a total of $18 trillion in deposits comprising both insured and uninsured deposits. That's less than 2% of the insured deposits. So when we start to see contagion taking place with capital outflows from banks, the FDIC does not have the balance sheet to solve the problem. The only solution is the Federal Reserve. In the case of Silicon Valley Bank, they had $175 billion in deposits only a few weeks ago. And then they experienced $47 billion of withdrawals in a single day before the regulator stepped in. The impact of contagion on the FDIC should be pretty plain to see. I know you're going to say that $20 billion of the $175 billion was in amounts covered by FDIC. But then the Treasury Department came out and backstopped all the depositors in Silicon Valley Bank and Silvergate Bank and Signature Bank. There's clearly not the liquidity within the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation to handle a major run on the banks in the event of contagion. So the Fed knows this. So that's why they backstopped the deposits for all three of these failed banks. The new rules implemented in the last couple of weeks allow any member bank to post U.S. Treasuries as collateral and give them access to cash at the Fed funds rate for up to a year. That should remove the need for banks to crash and burn due to lack of liquidity. However, if the regional banks experience an exodus of deposits in favor of the big banks that are considered too big to fail, we still have the issue. And Janet Yellen most recently indicated she is not on board with a blanket bailout of the banks in her most recent comments. The confusion being injected into the system is the result of a crisis of confidence. The outflow of capital from banks into treasuries is continuing throughout the past week. Credit Suisse has been sold. Silicon Valley Bank depositors have been made whole. Signature Bank's depositors, they're in a safe place. First Republic Bank is still twisting in the wind. We don't know what's going to happen there. Deutsche Bank is under the microscope. When Silicon Valley Bank was finally sold to First Citizens Bank, the FDIC took a $20 billion hit, which consumed 1/6 of their balance sheet in just that one single transaction. We're transitioned from the hypothetical not enough money discussion to a very real discussion. It's not going to take very much contagion to exhaust the FDIC. And on Friday, the Financial Stability Oversight Committee had an emergency meeting at the request of Janet Yellen. We don't know what it's going to take to restore confidence in the banking system. But for banks to lend money, they ultimately need to be backed by deposits. And if cash flows out of the banks and into treasuries, then the banks have less money to lend out. Banks will lose the ability to lend under the current mandate. The loss of lending power is going to need to be fixed one way or another, or we're going to face an economic collapse. The fact is, as soon as the Federal Reserve becomes the counterparty for every transaction, then we've become the victims of a transition to a central bank digital currency, whether we know it or not. The efforts to back the banks have already put the central bank in the transaction flow. At what point do they need the bank as a middleman any longer? I believe the transition to a central bank digital currency will happen in the middle of a crisis. We'll face the need to safeguard deposits, and in that moment of crisis, the private bank will have shaky trust. The only way to restore that trust will be to give each depositor the full weight and backing of the U.S. federal government. And at that point, we will be on a central bank digital currency without even calling it that. And the population will give up more of their privacy and security in response to a crisis. As you think about that, have an awesome rest of your day. Go make some great things happen. We'll talk to you again tomorrow.